In 1930s rural Kentucky, a young woman with barely enough money for boarding house rent was about to inherit a legacy no one else dared to claim. What started as a desperate attempt to salvage her late uncle's failing farm took a shocking turn when she came face to face with 6 massive animals that the entire county believed were cursed. Margaret Louise Thorne wasn't your typical small-town seamstress. For 12 formative years, she had spent her childhood helping Uncle Silas mend fences and study animal behavior on his eccentric farm, known for her stubborn curiosity that mirrored his own scientific mind. When she encountered the pigs emerging from the shadows of that rotting pen, watching her with unsettling intelligence, she had no idea she was walking into a battle against generations of superstition. Margaret made a choice in that moment that would lead to public ridicule, threats from powerful men, and a race against time to prove the impossible. What began as a burden of debt and decay would become a mission to preserve the last pure bloodline of the Moravian endurance breed. Animals so intelligent they had been mistaken for monsters. The people Harlan County would never be the same. After Margaret Thorne proved that sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as the most fearsome curses, and that the real danger was never the animals at all, but the fear that kept people from seeing their true worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. Margaret Thorne sat in the stiff-backed chair, her worn traveling dress pressed as neatly as she could manage, listening to Mr. Pemberton read through her uncle's will with the kind of careful monotone that suggested he had done this hundreds of times before. Outside, the Kentucky afternoon sun blazed against the window, but inside the room felt cold and official. And to my niece, Margaret Louise Thorne, I bequeath the entirety of my farm property, including all structures, livestock, and outstanding debts therein. Miss Pemberton paused, removing his spectacles to look at her directly. Miss Thorne, I feel obligated to inform you that the property carries considerable financial burden. Your Uncle Silas was eccentric in his final years. The farm has fallen into disrepair, and there are concerns about certain aspects of the inheritance. Margaret met his gaze steadily, though her heart hammered in her chest. She had known Uncle Silas was struggling. Everyone in Harlan County knew it, but she had not expected this inheritance, had not prepared herself for the weight of owning land when she could barely afford her boarding house room in town. What kind of concerns? She asked. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at Sheriff Thomas Avery, who stood near the door with his arms crossed. Perhaps the sheriff can explain better than I can. Sheriff Avery stepped forward, his weathered face showing the kind of reluctant concern Margaret had seen before when people thought they needed to protect her from harsh realities. Miss Margaret, your uncle's farm includes the old pig pen out back. I don't know if you remember it from when you were younger, but that pen has a reputation. Folks around here believe it's cursed. Animals raised there don't act right. 3 farmers tried to take pigs from that pen over the years, and every one of them had trouble. One nearly lost a hand. Margaret remembered the pen, though only vaguely. She had been 12 the last time she visited Uncle Silas regularly, before her mother had forbidden the trips, claiming Silas was filling her head with nonsense about animals and farming. The memory surfaced slowly, a ramshackle structure at the far edge of the property, always somehow darker than the rest of the farm, with weathered boards and strange scratching sounds coming from within. I'm not afraid of superstition, Sheriff, Margaret said quietly, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat. Be that as it may, Miss Thorne, there is the matter of the debts. Your uncle owed money to the feed store, to the bank, and to several neighbors. Henry Calhoun, in particular, has expressed interest in purchasing the property to settle those debts. He's offered a fair price, considering the circumstances. Margaret stood from her chair, smoothing her dress with hands that wanted to tremble but refused to show it. I'll need to see the property before I make any decisions. The drive to the farm took 20 minutes in Sheriff Avery's automobile, following rutted roads that wound through tobacco fields and past small farmhouses where chickens scattered at their approach. Margaret watched the landscape roll by, remembering summers spent helping Uncle Silas mend fences and feed chickens, listening to his stories about animal behavior and selective breeding that had fascinated her even as they confused her mother. When they arrived, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The farmhouse stood crooked on its foundation, paint peeling from the boards like sunburned skin. The barn had partially collapsed on one side, its roof sagging dangerously. Weeds had claimed the vegetable garden, and the fields beyond stretched empty and fallow, waiting for crops that would never be planted. But it was the pig pen that drew her attention. Set back from the other structures, surrounded by a fence that seemed sturdier than anything else on the property, the pen loomed like something out of a childhood nightmare. The boards were dark with age and moisture, and the roof had gaps that let in slanting bars of sunlight. No sounds came from within. "Are there still animals in there?" Margaret asked. Sheriff Avery nodded slowly. 6 of them, last count. Your uncle wouldn't let anyone near them toward the end. Fed them himself, every day, right up until he passed. Doc Hanson says he probably had the heart attack trying to haul water out there in the summer heat. Margaret walked toward the fence, her shoes crunching on the dry earth. Something moved in the shadows of the pen, and she stopped instinctively, her pulse quickening. "I wouldn't get too close, Miss Margaret," the sheriff warned. "Those animals aren't like regular pigs. They're big, and they're mean, and they remember people who've tried to handle them rough." But Margaret kept walking until she reached the fence, gripping the rough wood with both hands and peering into the darkness beyond. For a long moment she saw nothing. Then, gradually, shapes resolved themselves, large muscular bodies covered in coarse hair, intelligent eyes watching her from the shadows. One of the pigs moved closer, and Margaret could see the powerful shoulders, the alert posture, the way it studied her with an intensity that seemed almost human. She had expected monsters. She had expected the savage beasts of local legend. Instead, she saw animals that looked wary, watchful, and strangely dignified despite their rough appearance. "They don't look cursed to me," Margaret said softly. "They look neglected." Sheriff Avery joined her at the fence, keeping a respectful distance. "Your uncle thought the same thing toward the end. He used to say people didn't understand them, that they were special somehow. But Miss Margaret, maintaining this farm, keeping those animals fed and contained, it's going to cost money you don't have. Henry Calhoun's offer is generous. You could take that money, settle the debts, and still have enough to live comfortably in town while you find proper work." Margaret turned to face him, squaring her shoulders despite the fear churning in her stomach. "What kind of proper work, Sheriff? Sewing? Teaching? Serving tables at the hotel? I grew up on this farm. I know animals, and I know land, even if I've been away for a few years. My uncle left this to me for a reason. He left it to you because you were the only family he had left," the sheriff said gently. "That doesn't mean you have to sacrifice yourself trying to save something that's already lost." But Margaret had already made her decision. She could feel it settling into her bones like the Kentucky heat, uncomfortable but undeniable. She would not walk away from the only inheritance she would ever receive, the only piece of her uncle's strange, stubborn legacy. That evening, Margaret sat in the town's only hotel, counting the last of her savings and trying to calculate how long she could afford to stay before she would need to move to the farmhouse permanently. The numbers looked grim. She had enough for perhaps 2 weeks of room and board, enough to buy basic supplies, but not enough to hire help or make significant repairs. The sound of men's voices drifted up from the tavern below, and Margaret recognized Henry Calhoun's booming laugh. Curiosity drew her to crack open her door, listening to the conversation that filtered up the stairs. "She'll sell within a month," Henry was saying. "Woman like that, alone on a failing farm with those devil pigs. She'll come begging me to take it off her hands, and when she does, I'll pay half what I offered today." "That seems cruel, Henry," another voice said, one Margaret didn't recognize. Silas was a good man, even if he was strange. Silas was a fool who wasted good land on superstitious nonsense, Henry replied. Those pigs should have been butchered years ago, but he got it in his head they were valuable somehow. Now his niece is going to learn the hard way that sentiment doesn't pay debt. Margaret closed the door quietly, her jaw tight with anger. She had met Henry Calhoun once before, years ago when he and Uncle Silas had argued about property boundaries. She remembered him as a large man with a loud voice and a tendency to treat everyone around him like children who needed his guidance. She would not give him the satisfaction of being right. Dawn came cool and grey the next morning, mist hanging low over the fields as Margaret made her way back to the farm on foot, carrying a basket of supplies she could barely afford: work gloves, a hammer, nails, and a burlap sack of feed corn from the general store. The shopkeeper had looked at her with undisguised pity when she asked about pig feed, but he had sold it to her without comment. The farmhouse felt hollow and strange as Margaret pushed open the front door, years of dust and neglect evident in every corner. Uncle Silas's furniture remained where he had left it, covered in sheets that had yellowed with time. In the kitchen she found dishes still in the cabinet, a cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall, and a wood stove that looked like it might still work if she could get it cleaned and fired up properly. But it was the barn that drew her first. That mysterious collection of Uncle Silas's belongings that might hold answers to the questions churning in her mind. Why had he protected those pigs so fiercely? What had he seen in them that no one else could? The barn smelled of old hay and weathered wood, and shafts of sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the still air. Margaret picked her way carefully across the floor, avoiding weak spots where boards had rotted through, until she reached what had once been Uncle Silas's workshop area. Tools hung on the wall, organized with careful precision despite their age. A workbench stood against the far wall, its surface scarred with years of use. And there, tucked into a corner and covered with a tarp, Margaret found a collection of leather-bound notebooks, their pages filled with Uncle Silas's careful handwriting. She pulled the first notebook out, coughing as dust billowed up around her, and opened it to a random page. What she found made her breath catch. Day 47 of observation, the larger male, I've taken to calling him Duke, demonstrated problem-solving behavior again today. Opened the latch on the feed bin by watching me do it twice, then mimicking the motion with his snout. This confirms my theory that the breed retains intelligence traits that have been bred out of commercial stock. Must research European bloodlines further. Margaret flipped through more pages, finding detailed observations, sketches of pig anatomy, notes about behavior patterns, and breeding considerations. Her uncle had been conducting experiments, studying these animals with the dedication of a scientist, documenting everything he observed. One entry, dated just 3 months before his death, caught her attention. The townsfolk will never understand what I've preserved here. They see monsters because they expect monsters. They see danger because they fear anything that doesn't behave according to their narrow expectation. But these animals are remarkable. They communicate with each other. They remember, they learn. If I could just prove their value, show the agricultural community what careful breeding can preserve. But time is running out. My heart is failing, and I fear what will happen to the herd when I'm gone. I pray Margaret will understand. She always had her mother's kindness, but my stubborn curiosity. If anyone can see past the superstition, it would be her. Margaret closed the notebook carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Uncle Silas had left her more than just a farm and debts. He had left her a mission, a legacy of understanding that flew in the face of everything the town believed. She gathered several of the notebooks and carried them out of the barn, squinting in the bright morning sunlight. The pig pen stood quiet in the distance, and Margaret felt her resolve harden. She would not let fear or superstition dictate what happened to her uncle's life work. The feed corn was heavy in the burlap sack as she approached the pen, and Margaret felt her pulse quicken despite her determination. The pigs had appeared formidable from a distance yesterday, but approaching them alone, with no sheriff to intervene if something went wrong, felt infinitely more dangerous. She reached the fence and set down the sack, studying the pen's layout. There was a feeding trough accessible from outside, designed so someone could pour feed in without entering the pen itself. Uncle Silas had been careful at least, even if he had been passionate about protecting these animals. As Margaret lifted the sack to pour the corn into the trough, movement erupted from the pen's shadows. All 6 pigs emerged at once, moving with coordinated purpose that sent a chill down her spine. They were massive up close, easily 300 pounds each, with bristling coarse hair and powerful shoulders that rippled with muscle as they moved. But they did not charge the fence. Instead, they stopped several feet away, watching her with that same unsettling intelligence she had noticed yesterday. One of them, the largest male, stepped forward slightly, separating himself from the group. Duke, Margaret thought, remembering her uncle's notes. This must be the one he called Duke. Easy, Margaret whispered, more to herself than to the animals. I'm just feeding you, that's all. She poured the corn slowly into the trough, and the sound brought the pigs closer, but still they did not rush or fight. Instead, they approached in what seemed like an established order, the larger pigs allowing the smaller ones to feed first, everyone waiting their turn with remarkable patience. Margaret watched, fascinated. This was not the behavior of savage, cursed animals. This was the behavior of a disciplined group with established social rules. As the pigs ate, Margaret noticed other details her uncle had mentioned in his notes. The way they communicated with small grunts and body language, how they positioned themselves to keep watch while others fed, the alertness in their eyes that suggested constant awareness of their surroundings. Well, a voice said from behind her, making Margaret jump. I'll be damned, they didn't tear the fence down trying to get to you. Margaret turned to find Henry Calhoun standing 20 feet away, his thumbs hooked in his belt, a smirk on his weathered face. He was a large man, running to fat in middle age, with the kind of swagger that came from owning the most successful farm in the county. Why would they? Margaret asked, keeping her voice steady despite her hammering heart. Because that's what they do, sweetheart, Henry said, walking closer. The pigs immediately stopped eating, their attention snapping to the approaching man. Duke moved to the fence, and the sound that came from his throat was low and warning, nothing like the gentle grunts Margaret had heard moments before. Henry stopped walking, his smirk fading slightly. Vicious. Your uncle might have been able to handle them, but he grew up on farms. You've been working in town, doing woman's work. These animals will sense weakness, and when they do, they'll hurt you. Maybe kill you. They weren't aggressive until you approached, Margaret pointed out. Maybe they just don't like you. Henry's face darkened. You think you're clever, don't you? Just like Silas, too smart to listen to common sense. Let me tell you something, girl. I've been farming for 30 years. I know dangerous livestock when I see it. Those pigs are wrong somehow. Wrong in a way that means they should never have been kept alive. Do yourself a favor and let me buy this place. Use the money to make a proper life for yourself somewhere else. The farm isn't for sale, Mr. Calhoun, Margaret said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Henry studied her for a long moment, and something calculating entered his expression. Your uncle owed me money, you know. Nearly $200 for supplies I lent him over the years. I've been patient, but now that he's gone, I expect to be paid back. You have 60 days to settle the debt, or I'll have the bank foreclose on this property. Margaret's stomach dropped. $200, it might as well have been $2,000 for all the chance she had of raising it. But she refused to let Henry see her fear. I'll find a way to pay you, she said. Sure you will, Henry replied, tipping his hat with mocking politeness. Good luck with your cursed pigs, Miss Thorne. He walked away whistling, and Margaret turned back to the pen, her hands shaking now that he was gone. The pigs had relaxed again, returning to their feed, but Duke remained at the fence, watching her with those intelligent eyes. I guess it's you and me against the world, Margaret whispered to him. I hope Uncle Silas was right about you. Sunday service at the Harlan County Methodist Church had always been more about social gathering than worship, and Margaret had forgotten how much information traveled through the congregation in the hour before and after the sermon. She sat in the back pew wearing her best dress, feeling the weight of curious stares and hearing the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough to be discreet. "That's Silas Thorne's niece," someone murmured behind her. "Heard she's keeping those devil pigs instead of having them put down. Poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into," another voice replied. "Remember what happened to Tom Harrison when he tried to butcher one? Animal nearly took his arm off. Silas always did have strange ideas. Guess they run in the family." Margaret kept her eyes forward, focusing on the minister's sermon about patience and faith, trying to ignore the heat that crept up her neck. She had known the town would talk. She had not expected it to feel so isolating, so suffocating. After the service, as the congregation spilled out into the autumn sunshine, Margaret tried to slip away unnoticed, but a gentle hand on her arm stopped her. "Miss Thorne, Margaret." She turned to find a woman about her age, dressed in a simple blue dress, with intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Margaret recognized her after a moment. Lydia Roan, the schoolteacher, who had been a few years ahead of her in school before Margaret's family had moved away. "I'm Lydia," the woman said with a warm smile. "I don't know if you remember me, but I wanted to welcome you back to Harlan County. I was sorry to hear about your uncle. Silas was a fascinating man." Margaret felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the kindness in Lydia's voice. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say. I mean it," Lydia said, guiding Margaret away from the main crowd toward the shade of a large oak tree. "I used to visit your uncle sometimes, bringing him books from the school library. He was interested in agricultural journals, breeding studies, animal behavior. We would talk for hours about his theories." "Did he tell you about the pigs?" Margaret asked carefully. Lydia's expression grew thoughtful. "He did. He showed me some of his research. I'll admit, I was skeptical at first. The stories about that pen have been circulating for years, but your uncle was convinced those animals were something special, a remnant of an old European breed that was prized for intelligence and endurance. He believed the curse was nothing more than people misunderstanding animals they weren't equipped to handle properly." Margaret pulled one of Uncle Silas's notebooks from her bag, the one she had been reading that morning before church. "I found these in the barn." He documented everything. "Lydia, these pigs aren't like regular livestock. They learn, they communicate, they solve problems. I've seen it myself, just in the few days I've been feeding them." Lydia took the notebook carefully, flipping through pages with growing interest. "This is remarkable work," she said softly. "Margaret, if your uncle was right, if these animals really are as intelligent as he believed, they could be incredibly valuable, not just for their meat, but for breeding, for work, for research." "Valuable how?" Margaret asked. "Henry Calhoun wants to buy the farm, and everyone in town thinks I should sell. If I'm going to keep it, I need to find a way to make it profitable. I need to pay Uncle Silas's debts." Before Lydia could answer, Sheriff Avery approached, his expression grave. "Miss Margaret, could I have a word?" Margaret's heart sank at his tone, but she nodded, following him a short distance away while Lydia waited discreetly under the tree. "I got a complaint this morning," the sheriff said without preamble. "Henry Calhoun says one of your pigs tried to attack him yesterday when he visited the farm." "That's not what happened," Margaret said quickly. "The pigs were calm until Henry approached aggressively. They were defensive, not attacking. Be that as it may, several folks in town are concerned about having dangerous animals so close to the community. There are children who play in those fields, families who live nearby. If something were to happen, if one of those pigs were to get loose and hurt someone..." The sheriff trailed off, but his meaning was clear. "They won't get loose," Margaret said. "The fence is secure, and I'm careful when feeding them. Sheriff, those animals aren't dangerous if they're treated properly. My uncle worked with them for years without incident." "Your uncle was an experienced farmer," The sheriff replied, "No offense, Miss Margaret, but you're a young woman who's been working in a boarding house. Folks are right to be concerned about whether you can handle livestock that even seasoned farmers won't touch. Because they're afraid of superstition," Margaret argued. "Because they believe stories instead of observing the actual animals." Sheriff Avery sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his graying hair. "I'm trying to help you here. The town council is meeting next week, and Henry's going to bring up the issue of those pigs. If enough people speak against you, they could order the animals destroyed for public safety. Your best bet is to sell them now before it comes to that." "Sell them to who?" Margaret demanded. "Who would buy them if everyone thinks they're cursed?" "Henry's offered to take them off your hands for a fair price, $20 for the lot." $20 for 6 pigs that her uncle had considered valuable enough to protect with his life. Margaret felt anger rise hot in her chest. "No," she said flatly, "I won't sell them, and I won't let them be destroyed. Those animals are part of my property, and I have every right to keep them." The sheriff replaced his hat, his expression sympathetic but resigned. "Then you'd better be prepared to prove they're not a danger at that council meeting. Bring evidence. Bring witnesses. Bring something that shows you can control them. Otherwise, I can't protect you from what the council might decide." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the churchyard, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Around her, the congregation continued their Sunday socializing, but Margaret could feel their eyes on her, could sense the judgment and doubt radiating from every cluster of conversation. Lydia appeared at her elbow, the notebook still in her hands. "I heard some of that," she said quietly. "Margaret, I want to help. I believe what your uncle was doing was important, and I don't think you should have to fight this battle alone." Margaret looked at her, this near stranger offering kindness in a town full of suspicion, and felt tears prick at her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me? You barely know me." "Because I'm a teacher," Lydia said simply. "I've spent my life watching people dismiss things they don't understand, seeing curiosity and intelligence punished because they don't fit expected patterns. Your uncle was trying to preserve something remarkable, and I think you might be the only person brave enough to finish what he started." That afternoon, Margaret returned to the farm with renewed determination. She spent hours in the barn, reading through every notebook she could find, absorbing Uncle Silas's careful observations and theories. She learned about the breed's origins in Eastern Europe, how they had been imported to America in limited numbers in the 1890s for experimental farming programs. She read about their remarkable endurance, their ability to forage and survive in harsh conditions, their strong social bonds and capacity for learning. But most importantly, she found her uncle's notes about the curse and how it had begun. Apparently, the first farmer to receive pigs from this bloodline had tried to force them into standard commercial farming practices, confined spaces, aggressive handling, quick fattening for slaughter. The pigs had resisted violently, injuring several workers and escaping multiple times. Rather than recognizing that these animals required different treatment, the farmer had spread stories about their vicious nature, and the reputation had stuck. Every subsequent farmer who acquired pigs from the line had approached them with fear and aggression, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict and danger. "You weren't wrong, Uncle Silas," Margaret whispered to the empty barn. "Everyone else was just too scared to see it." As twilight fell, Margaret walked back to the pig pen for evening feeding, carrying not just corn but also a whistle she had found among her uncle's things. According to his notes, he had been training the pigs to respond to different sounds, teaching them simple commands through positive reinforcement. The pigs emerged from the shadows as they always did, but this time Margaret tried something different. Before pouring the feed, she blew the whistle once, short and sharp. The pigs stopped immediately, ears alert, watching her. She pointed to the trough, then blew the whistle again. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Duke moved forward, approaching the trough, but not eating, looking back at her, as if waiting for permission. Margaret's breath caught. She blew the whistle a third time, and Duke began to eat. The others followed, maintaining that remarkable order and discipline she had noticed before. "You understand, don't you?" Margaret said softly. "You're not cursed. You're just smart enough to know when people are treating you wrong." She stood at the fence until full darkness fell, watching the pigs settle into their shelter for the night, and thought about the impossible task ahead of her. She had to prove to an entire town that their fears were groundless, that generations of superstition were based on misunderstanding rather than truth. She had to find a way to make these animals profitable enough to pay her uncle's debts and save the farm. And she had to do it all while fighting against people like Henry Calhoun, who would rather see her fail than admit they might have been wrong. The challenge felt overwhelming, but as she walked back to the farmhouse in the darkness, Margaret found herself thinking not about failure, but about possibility. Her uncle had believed these pigs were valuable. Lydia believed they were worth protecting. And Margaret, despite all her doubts and fears, was beginning to believe it too. She would fight for them. She would prove their worth. And she would show everyone in Harlan County that sometimes the most valuable things come disguised as the most fearsome curse. Margaret stood at the pig pen fence at dawn, her uncle's journal open in one hand and a bucket of feed in the other. She had spent the night reading his training notes, studying the methods he had used to prove the pig's intelligence. Now she was ready to test his theories herself. She blew the whistle twice, watching as all 6 pigs emerged from their shelter with that remarkable coordination. Duke led the group as always, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. Margaret had begun to recognize each pig individually now. Duke the leader, Bessie the smaller female, who always stayed close to Duke, 3 younger pigs she had named Scout, Ranger, and Pepper, and finally old Maggie, who moved more slowly but commanded respect from the others. "Good morning," Margaret said softly, and Duke's ears twitched at her voice. "Today we're going to try something new." She had constructed a simple puzzle from scrap wood found in the barn, following her uncle's diagrams, a wooden box with a sliding panel that, when moved correctly, would release feed into a trough. According to Silas's notes, Duke had learned to operate similar mechanisms within days. Margaret positioned the box outside the fence, where the pigs could reach it with their snouts, then demonstrated the sliding motion 3 times, each time rewarding the action with a handful of corn. Duke watched intently, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement of her hand. On the 4th attempt, Margaret stepped back and waited. Duke approached the box, studying it for a long moment. Then, with deliberate precision, he pushed the panel with his snout. It moved slightly, but not enough to release the feed. Duke tried again, adjusting his angle, and this time the panel slid fully open. Corn spilled into the trough, and the other pigs grunted with excitement. Margaret's heart raced. She had seen it happen, but witnessing the intelligence firsthand felt different than reading about it in dusty notebooks. This was proof, tangible and undeniable. "That's incredible," a voice said from behind her. Margaret turned to find Lydia approaching, carrying a leather satchel and wearing a practical work dress instead of her Sunday clothes. "I hope you don't mind me visiting. I brought some agricultural journals from the school library. I thought they might help with your research." "Lydia, you have to see this," Margaret said, her excitement overriding her usual reserve. She reset the puzzle box and called Duke back. The pig solved it again, faster this time, having learned the pattern. Lydia's eyes widened behind her spectacles. "Margaret, this is remarkable. I've never seen livestock demonstrate problem-solving like this. We need to document everything. If you can show the town council evidence of their intelligence, evidence that these animals are trainable and valuable, they might reconsider their position." Over the next week, Margaret and Lydia worked together every day, testing the pigs with increasingly complex puzzles and challenges. They discovered that the animals could recognize individual people by sight and sound, that they responded to different whistle patterns with specific behaviors, and that they communicated with each other through subtle vocalizations and body language that suggested genuine coordination. Duke proved especially remarkable. He could open latches, navigate simple mazes, and even seemed to anticipate Margaret's commands before she gave them. The younger pigs learned by watching him, mimicking his solutions to problems with astounding accuracy. But while Margaret and Lydia documented their findings with growing excitement, the town's suspicion deepened. Henry Calhoun made daily visits to neighboring farms, spreading doubt about Margaret's competence and warning of the danger posed by her wild animals. Margaret could feel the pressure building, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The town council meeting was held on a Wednesday evening at the church hall, and Margaret arrived early with Lydia at her side, carrying a portfolio of observations, diagrams, and documented evidence of the pig's intelligence. She had practiced her presentation for hours, determined to be calm and professional despite the fear churning in her stomach. The hall filled quickly. Henry Calhoun sat in the front row with several other prominent farmers, their expressions ranging from skeptical to hostile. Sheriff Avery stood near the door, his weathered face neutral but his eyes sympathetic. Margaret recognized other faces from church, from the general store, from her childhood visits to the farm. All of them had come to judge whether she deserved to keep her inheritance. Mayor Preston called the meeting to order, his jowls quivering as he spoke. "We're here to discuss the matter of the Thorne farm and the livestock in question. Henry Calhoun has raised concerns about public safety. Mr. Calhoun, would you like to present your case?" Henry stood, his bulk imposing in the small space. "Thank you, Mayor. Folks, we all knew Silas Thorne, good man in his youth, but everyone knows he went peculiar toward the end. Those pigs of his, they're not normal livestock. They're aggressive, unpredictable, and dangerous. Just last week, one of them tried to attack me when I visited the farm to check on Miss Thorne's welfare." "That's not true," Margaret interrupted, standing abruptly. "The pigs were defensive because you approached them aggressively. They never left their pen, never threatened you." Henry turned to face her, his expression patronizing. "Miss Thorne, I understand you want to honor your uncle's memory, but you're a young woman with no real farming experience. You've been in town working at a boarding house. These animals require expertise you simply don't have." "I've been studying them for 2 weeks, Margaret said, her voice shaking, but determined. "I've been documenting their behavior, testing their intelligence, following my uncle's research. These pigs aren't dangerous, they're remarkable. They can solve problems, learn commands, work cooperatively. They're valuable animals being judged by fear and superstition instead of facts." "Valuable," Henry scoffed. "The only value those animals have is as meat, and no butcher in 3 counties will touch them after what happened to Tom Harrison." "What happened to Tom Harrison was his own fault," Lydia said, standing beside Margaret. "He tried to slaughter one of these pigs using rough handling and improper equipment. The animal defended itself, as any intelligent creature would. That doesn't make them monsters, it makes them survivors." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded thoughtfully, but others shook their heads with obvious disapproval. Mayor Preston banged his gavel. "Order, please. Miss Thorne, do you have evidence to support your claims?" Margaret opened her portfolio with trembling hands, spreading diagrams and observation notes across the table. "My uncle spent years studying these animals. They're descended from a rare European breed, prized for intelligence and endurance. They're not common commercial pigs. They're working animals that require understanding and proper training. I can demonstrate their capabilities if you'll give me the chance." "Demonstrations can be faked," Henry said dismissively. "What we need is common sense. Those animals are a danger to this community, and Miss Thorne lacks the experience to control them. For everyone's safety, they should be destroyed, and the farm should be sold to someone who knows what they're doing." "Someone like you," Margaret challenged. Henry's face reddened. "I'm offering a solution to a problem, Miss Thorne. You still owe me $200, and that debt comes due in 40 days. Even if the council allows you to keep those animals, you'll never make enough money to pay what you owe. Be reasonable. Sell now, while you still can." Sheriff Avery stepped forward. "Mayor, if I may, Miss Thorne has broken no laws. Those animals are contained on her property, and she has every right to keep them. Unless we have concrete evidence of danger, not just rumors and old stories, I don't see grounds for intervention." "The evidence is common knowledge," Henry argued. "Everyone in this county knows those pigs are cursed. We're just waiting for tragedy to strike." The debate continued for another hour, voices rising and falling in waves of argument and counter-argument. Margaret defended herself as best she could, Lydia supporting her with research and logic, but she could feel the room's sentiment turning against her. Fear was easier than understanding, superstition more comfortable than science. Finally, Mayor Preston called for a vote. "All in favor of ordering the destruction of the livestock in question, raise your hands." Margaret held her breath as hands rose throughout the room. Not everyone, but enough. Too many. All opposed. Fewer hands this time, scattered and hesitant. The mayor counted carefully, then cleared his throat. "The motion fails by 3 votes. However, Miss Thorne, you are hereby ordered to prove that these animals pose no danger to the community. You have 30 days to demonstrate their value and trainability in a public setting. If you cannot provide satisfactory evidence, this council will reconvene to reconsider their disposal. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had won a reprieve, nothing more. 30 days to prove the impossible. As the crowd dispersed, Henry approached her with a cold smile. 30 days, Miss Thorne. That's not much time to work miracles. My offer still stands if you come to your senses. Margaret met his gaze steadily. I'll prove their worth, Mr. Calhoun, and when I do, everyone will see that the only curse on those animals was other people's ignorance. Margaret sat at her uncle's kitchen table surrounded by notebooks, her oil lamp burning low as midnight approached. She had been reading for hours, searching for something, anything, that would help her prove the pig's value to a skeptical town. Lydia had gone home hours ago, promising to return in the morning with more research materials. Then Margaret found it. Tucked into the back of the oldest journal, a letter written in her uncle's shaking hand, dated just weeks before his death. To whomever inherits my work, these animals represent the last pure bloodline of the Moravian endurance breed, imported from Eastern Europe in 1892 for agricultural trials. They were bred not for meat or speed, but for stamina, intelligence, and the ability to work in harsh conditions where other livestock would fail. The original breeding program was abandoned after the economic panic of 1893, and most of the bloodline was lost to commercial crossbreeding. I acquired my breeding pair from an old farmer in Virginia who had preserved them out of stubborn pride. For 20 years I have protected this line, studied them, documented their remarkable capabilities. These pigs can pull heavy loads for miles, navigate difficult terrain, remember complex routes and commands. In Europe, they were used for long-distance transport of goods, for truffle hunting, for mountain farming, where horses couldn't safely travel. But American farmers don't understand them. They expect pigs to be docile, stupid, easy to control. The Moravian breed is none of these things. They are proud, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to those who earn their trust. Mishandled, they become dangerous. Respected, they are invaluable. I fear I have failed them by keeping them secret, by protecting them so well that no one else learned to appreciate them. If you are reading this, I pray you are someone brave enough to show the world what I could not. Silas Thorne. Margaret read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding. Endurance breed. Long-distance transport. These weren't just intelligent pigs. They were working animals with specific valuable capabilities. If she could demonstrate those capabilities publicly, prove they could perform tasks that ordinary livestock couldn't, she might save them. But how? She had 30 days and almost no money. She would need equipment, a demonstration route, witnesses who would judge fairly, and she would need to train the pigs to work together in a way that showcased their unique abilities. The next morning brought unexpected help. Lydia arrived with two companions, a young farmer named Robert Mills, who had been skeptical of the curse stories, and Doc Hansen, the veterinarian who had treated Uncle Silas in his final days. "I brought reinforcements," Lydia announced. "Robert thinks you might be onto something worth investigating, and Doc Hansen wants to examine your pigs properly. He says if they're truly a rare breed, their physical characteristics should prove it." Doc Hansen, a grizzled man in his 60s with kind eyes, set down his medical bag. "Silas talked about these animals for years, but I never got close enough to examine them properly. If you'll let me, I'd like to do a proper veterinary assessment, measure them, check their bone structure, document their condition. If they're truly a distinct breed, that information could be valuable." Sheriff Avery stepped forward. "Mayor, if I may, Miss Thorne has broken no laws. Those animals are contained on her property, and she has every right to keep them. Unless we have concrete evidence of danger, not just rumors and old stories, I don't see grounds for intervention." "The evidence is common knowledge," Henry argued. "Everyone in this county knows those pigs are cursed. We're just waiting for tragedy to strike." The debate continued for another hour, voices rising and falling in waves of argument and counter-argument. Margaret defended herself as best she could, Lydia supporting her with research and logic, but she could feel the room's sentiment turning against her. Fear was easier than understanding, superstition more comfortable than science. Finally, Mayor Preston called for a vote. "All in favor of ordering the destruction of the livestock in question, raise your hands." Margaret held her breath as hands rose throughout the room. Not everyone, but enough. Too many. All opposed, fewer hands this time, scattered and hesitant. The mayor counted carefully, then cleared his throat. "The motion fails by 3 votes. However, Miss Thorne, you are hereby ordered to prove that these animals pose no danger to the community. You have 30 days to demonstrate their value and trainability in a public setting. If you cannot provide satisfactory evidence, this council will reconvene to reconsider their disposal. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had won a reprieve, nothing more. 30 days to prove the impossible. As the crowd dispersed, Henry approached her with a cold smile. 30 days, Miss Thorne. That's not much time to work miracles. My offer still stands, if you come to your senses." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I'll prove their worth, Mr. Calhoun. And when I do, everyone will see that the only curse on those animals was other people's ignorance." Margaret sat at her uncle's kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks, her oil lamp burning low as midnight approached. She had been reading for hours, searching for something, anything, that would help her prove the pig's value to a skeptical town. Lydia had gone home hours ago, promising to return in the morning with more research materials. Then Margaret found it. Tucked into the back of the oldest journal, a letter written in her uncle's shaking hand, dated just weeks before his death. "To whomever inherits my work, these animals represent the last pure bloodline of the Moravian endurance breed, imported from Eastern Europe in 1892 for agricultural trials. They were bred not for meat or speed, but for stamina, intelligence, and the ability to work in harsh conditions where other livestock would fail. The original breeding program was abandoned after the economic panic of 1893, and most of the bloodline was lost to commercial crossbreeding. I acquired my breeding pair from an old farmer in Virginia, who had preserved them out of stubborn pride. For 20 years I have protected this line, studied them, documented their remarkable capabilities. These pigs can pull heavy loads for miles, navigate difficult terrain, remember complex routes and commands. In Europe they were used for long-distance transport of goods, for truffle hunting, for mountain farming, where horses couldn't safely travel. But American farmers don't understand them. They expect pigs to be docile, stupid, easy to control. The Moravian breed is none of these things. They are proud, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to those who earn their trust. Mishandled, they become dangerous. Respected, they are invaluable. I fear I have failed them by keeping them secret, by protecting them so well that no one else learned to appreciate them. If you are reading this, I pray you are someone brave enough to show the world what I could not. Silas Thorne." Margaret read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding. Endurance breed. Long-distance transport. These weren't just intelligent pigs. They were working animals with specific valuable capabilities. If she could demonstrate those capabilities publicly, prove they could perform tasks that ordinary livestock couldn't, she might save them. But how? She had 30 days and almost no money. She would need equipment, a demonstration route, witnesses who would judge fairly, and she would need to train the pigs to work together in a way that showcased their unique abilities. The next morning brought unexpected help. Lydia arrived with 2 companions, a young farmer named Robert Mills, who had been skeptical of the curse stories, and Doc Hansen, the veterinarian who had treated Uncle Silas in his final days. "I brought reinforcements," Lydia announced. "Robert thinks you might be onto something worth investigating, and Doc Hansen wants to examine your pigs properly. He says if they're truly a rare breed, their physical characteristics should prove it." Doc Hansen, a grizzled man in his 60s with kind eyes, set down his medical bag. "Silas talked about these animals for years, but I never got close enough to examine them properly. If you'll let me, I'd like to do a proper veterinary assessment, measure them, check their bone structure, document their condition. If they're truly a distinct breed, that information could be valuable." Margaret felt hope flicker in her chest. "Yes, please. Anything that helps prove what they are." The examination took most of the morning. The pigs, surprisingly, allowed Doc Hansen to approach them with Margaret present, though they remained wary. He measured their dimensions, studied their teeth and hooves, examined their muscular structure with professional thoroughness. "Remarkable," he muttered repeatedly. "Look at the depth of chest, the bone density. These aren't commercial stock, that's certain. The muscle attachment points suggest animals bred for sustained work rather than rapid weight gain. And their temperament, Miss Thorne, they're calm with you, but alert to threats. That's not aggression, that's intelligence. Can you document this?" Margaret asked. "Will your professional opinion carry weight with the council?" Doc Hansen nodded slowly. "It should. I'll write a full report. But Margaret, even with documentation, you'll need to demonstrate what these animals can actually do. Words and measurements won't be enough. You'll need to show the town something they can't dismiss." That afternoon, Margaret stood at the pig pen, with a plan forming in her mind. If the Moravian breed was known for endurance and transport capability, she would demonstrate exactly that. She would organize a public hauling trial, showing the pigs could pull loaded carts farther and more efficiently than anyone expected. It was ambitious, perhaps impossible, but it was the only chance she had. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the demonstration with an intensity that surprised even Lydia. She constructed a hauling harness from leather and rope, following diagrams she found in her uncle's notes. She trained the pigs daily, teaching them to work together, pulling increasingly heavy loads around the farm. And she carefully planned a route through town that would showcase their endurance without putting anyone at risk. Duke took to the harness naturally, his powerful shoulders perfectly suited for pulling work. The younger pigs learned by watching him, and soon Margaret had all 6 animals working in coordinated teams, responding to her whistle commands with remarkable precision. Lydia helped spread word about the demonstration, framing it as an educational event about rare livestock breeds. Robert Mills built a sturdy cart designed to show weight capacity. Even Sheriff Avery, cautiously supportive, agreed to help manage the crowd and ensure safety. The demonstration was scheduled for a Saturday morning, giving townsfolk no excuse to miss it. Margaret barely slept the night before, running through every possible disaster scenario in her mind. What if the pigs refused to cooperate? What if something spooked them and they proved the town's fears correct? What if Henry sabotaged the entire event? Dawn arrived cold and clear. Margaret fed the pigs their morning meal, checked their harnesses 3 times, and whispered encouragement that was as much for herself as for them. "We can do this," she told Duke, scratching behind his ears. "We have to." By 9 o'clock a crowd had gathered in the town square. Margaret estimated at least 50 people, maybe more. Some looked curious, others skeptical, many openly hostile. Henry Calhoun stood at the front with his arms crossed. his expression promising trouble. Margaret led the pigs into the square, their harnesses gleaming with polish, their movements calm and coordinated. The crowd murmured, some people stepping back instinctively, but the pigs ignored the onlookers, focused entirely on Margaret and her commands. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret announced, her voice carrying across the square, despite her nervousness. These animals are Moravian endurance pigs, a rare European breed once prized for their intelligence, strength, and stamina. Today I'm going to demonstrate capabilities that most people believe impossible for swine. She loaded the cart with bags of feed, borrowed from Robert Mills, 200 pounds of weight, that made the cart's wheels creak. The crowd watched as Margaret hitched Duke and Bessie to the cart, then stepped back and blew her whistle once. The pigs leaned into their harnesses and pulled. The cart moved smoothly, rolling forward with steady progress. Margaret walked beside them, guiding with whistle commands as they navigated the square, turned corners, and even backed the cart up on command. Well trained, I'll give you that, Henry called out. But any animal can be trained to pull a cart in a controlled setting. Let's see how they handle real work, real stress. Before Margaret could respond, Henry strode forward and kicked at the cart's wheel, creating a loud bang. The pigs startled, snorting with alarm, and for a terrible moment Margaret thought they would bolt or attack. The crowd gasped, children crying out in fear, but then Duke stopped, planting his feet firmly. He looked back at Margaret, waiting for her command despite the chaos around him. Bessie followed his lead, the other pigs taking their cue from the leaders. Margaret's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. Easy, she called out. Hold steady. The pigs held their position, breathing hard, but controlled. Margaret walked to Duke, placed her hand on his shoulder, and felt the tension slowly drain from his powerful frame. That's what intelligence looks like, she said to the crowd. Not blind panic, not rage, but self-control and trust. These animals aren't cursed or dangerous. They're remarkable, and they're worth preserving. Sheriff Avery stepped forward, his face stern. Henry Calhoun, you deliberately tried to spook those animals. If Miss Thorne's pigs had injured someone because of your recklessness, you'd be liable. I suggest you step back. Henry's face flushed red, but he retreated, muttering under his breath about foolish women and wasted time. Margaret completed the demonstration route, her pigs pulling the loaded cart through town and back without incident. By the time she returned to the square, the crowd's mood had shifted. Not everyone was convinced, but doubt had crept into their certainty. Some people were even smiling, impressed despite themselves. Doc Hanson approached as Margaret unhitched the pigs, his expression thoughtful. Miss Thorne, that was quite a display. I believe you've proven your point about their trainability. I'll recommend to the council that these animals be recognized as valuable working livestock rather than threats to public safety. Margaret wanted to collapse with relief, but she kept her composure, thanking everyone who had helped make the demonstration possible. As the crowd dispersed, Lydia rushed forward and hugged her tightly. You did it, Lydia whispered. Margaret, you actually did it. But even as Margaret accepted congratulations from Robert Mills and sympathetic townsfolk, she knew the battle wasn't over. Henry Calhoun watched from across the square, his expression calculating and cold. She had proven the pigs weren't cursed, but she still owed him $200, and she still had less than 2 weeks to find the money. The fight for her inheritance was far from finished. 10 days remained until Henry Calhoun's debt came due, and Margaret still had no clear path to raising $200. The town demonstration had proven the pigs weren't cursed, but proving they weren't dangerous was different from proving they were profitable. She needed something more, something that would convince not just the town council but potential buyers or business partners that the Moravian breed had genuine commercial value. The answer came from an unexpected source. Robert Mills appeared at the farm on a Tuesday morning, his work clothes dusty from the road, leading a mule hitched to a wagon loaded with supplies. Miss Thorne, he called out as Margaret emerged from the barn. I've got a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, studying the young farmer with cautious hope. Robert had been one of the few who defended her at the council meeting, but she knew better than to trust too easily. I'm listening. I need to transport goods to Pineville, about 18 miles from here. Usually takes me 2 days with the mule, stopping overnight halfway because the terrain is rough and the load is heavy. But I've been thinking about what your uncle's note said, about those pigs being bred for long-distance hauling in mountain country. Robert paused, scratching his jaw. What if we tested them? A real endurance trial with a full commercial load. If your pigs can make the trip faster and more efficiently than my mule, I'll pay you $50 and spread word to every farmer in 3 counties about what they can do. $50, a quarter of what Margaret owed, and more importantly, proof of commercial viability that could attract other opportunities. But 18 miles over rough Kentucky terrain with a heavy load was far more demanding than anything she had attempted with the pigs. What's in it for you? Margaret asked carefully. Honestly, curiosity and maybe a bit of spite toward Henry Calhoun. Robert smiled ruefully. He's been lording it over the smaller farmers for years, acting like he's the only one who knows anything about livestock and land. I'd enjoy seeing him proven wrong. Plus, if your pigs are as good as your uncle claimed, having access to that breeding line could help a lot of farmers who can't afford horses. Margaret looked toward the pig pen, where Duke and the others were resting in the afternoon shade. 18 miles. It was ambitious, potentially dangerous if something went wrong. But it was also exactly the kind of demonstration that would silence doubters permanently. When would we leave? She asked. Day after tomorrow. Dawn. That gives you time to prepare your animals and get your harnesses ready. Lydia Rowan already said she'd come along to document the trial, and Sheriff Avery agreed to ride escort to make sure everything stays fair and safe. Margaret extended her hand, shaking Robert's firmly. You have a deal, Mr. Mills. We'll be ready. The next day and a half passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret reinforced the harnesses, checked every buckle and strap 3 times, and ran the pigs through practice drills until they responded to her whistle commands with perfect precision. Lydia arrived with notebooks and a camera borrowed from the school, ready to document every stage of the journey. Doc Hanson stopped by to examine the pigs one final time, pronouncing them in excellent condition for the trial. But it was the evening before departure that brought unwelcome news. Sheriff Avery appeared at the farm just as Margaret was finishing the evening feeding. His expression troubled. Henry Calhoun knows about the trial, he said without preamble. He's been at the tavern all afternoon, telling anyone who'll listen that you're putting people at risk by taking those animals on public roads. He's talking about filing an injunction to stop the trial. Margaret felt cold fear settle in her stomach. Can he do that? Legally, probably not, since you'll be on public roads with proper supervision, but he can cause trouble, spread doubt, maybe convince the mayor to intervene. Sheriff Avery shifted his weight uncomfortably. Miss Margaret, I'll be riding with you tomorrow, and I'll make sure Henry doesn't interfere directly. But you should know he's desperate. He wants that land, and he won't give up easy. I understand, Margaret said quietly. Thank you for the warning, Sheriff. After he left, Margaret stood alone at the pig pen in the gathering darkness, watching Duke and the others settle for the night. Tomorrow would determine everything, the farm's future, the pig's survival, and her ability to honor her uncle's legacy. Failure wasn't an option she could afford to consider. Dawn arrived cold and misty, the autumn air carrying hints of the winter to come. Margaret hitched Duke, Bessie, and Scout to Robert's wagon, which had been loaded with 250 pounds of flour, feed and dry goods destined for Pineville's general store. The 3 pigs stood calmly in their harnesses, breath steaming in the cool air, waiting for her command. Lydia checked her camera, Robert tested the wagon wheels one final time, and Sheriff Avery sat astride his horse, scanning the empty road with practiced vigilance. A small crowd had gathered to see them off, some supportive, others clearly skeptical. Henry Calhoun was notably absent, which worried Margaret more than his presence would have. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced, her voice carrying across the quiet morning. "Today we're demonstrating the working capability of the Moravian endurance breed over 18 miles of Kentucky terrain. These pigs will pull a commercial load comparable to what a mule would haul, and will document the entire journey for anyone who doubts their value." She turned to Duke, placed her hand briefly on his powerful shoulder, then stepped back and blew her whistle. The pigs leaned into their harnesses, and the wagon began to roll. The first 5 miles passed smoothly. The road was relatively flat, winding through farmland and past scattered homesteads, where people stopped their morning chores to watch the unusual procession pass. The pigs maintained a steady pace, faster than Margaret had dared hope, their powerful legs eating up distance with rhythmic efficiency. Duke led with confidence, Bessie and Scout following his pace perfectly, the 3 animals working together as though they shared a single mind. Lydia took photographs at regular intervals, documenting the pigs' condition and progress. Robert walked beside the wagon, occasionally checking the load to ensure nothing shifted. Margaret stayed close to Duke's head, ready to give commands, but finding she rarely needed to. The pigs knew what was expected and performed with remarkable competence. But as they approached the 7th-mile marker, where the road began climbing into rougher hill country, trouble arrived in the form of Henry Calhoun and 3 other farmers blocking the path ahead. "That's far enough," Henry announced, his bulk imposing in the narrow road. "Miss Thorne, you're endangering public safety by parading these animals through populated areas. I'm ordering you to turn back. You have no authority to order anything, Miss Calhoun," Sheriff Avery said calmly, guiding his horse between Henry and the wagon. "Miss Thorne has every right to use public roads for legitimate business." "Legitimate?" Henry scoffed. "She's conducting a circus act with dangerous animals. What happens when they panic on this steep terrain and hurt someone?" "They're not going to panic," Margaret said, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. "They're trained working animals performing exactly the task they were bred for." "Then prove it," Henry challenged. "Let's see how they handle real stress." Before anyone could stop him, Henry grabbed a large rock from the roadside and hurled it toward the wagon. It struck the wooden side with a crack that echoed off the hillsides. The pigs startled, snorting with alarm, and for a terrible moment, the wagon lurched forward as they tensed against their harnesses. "Steady," Margaret commanded, her whistle sharp and clear. "Hold position." Duke planted his feet, his massive shoulders straining as he brought his own momentum under control. Bessie and Scout followed his lead instantly, the 3 pigs stopping the wagon's forward roll through sheer disciplined strength. They stood trembling but controlled, waiting for Margaret's next command despite the chaos Henry had created. Sheriff Avery dismounted quickly, his face dark with anger. "Henry Calhoun, that's the 2nd time you've deliberately tried to spook Miss Thorne's animals. One more incident, and I'll have you arrested for reckless endangerment. Now get out of this road before I make you regret testing my patience." Henry opened his mouth to argue, caught the sheriff's expression, and apparently thought better of it. He stalked away with his companions following, but not before throwing one final comment over his shoulder. "You've still got 9 days to pay what you owe. Miss Thorne, no amount of circus tricks will change that." Margaret waited until her hands stopped shaking, then approached Duke and ran her fingers through his coarse hair. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did so well. All of you did." The incident had proven something important, though. Under genuine stress and surprise, the pigs had defaulted to training and trust rather than panic or aggression. It was exactly the kind of evidence Margaret needed. The remaining 11s tested the pigs' endurance more severely. The terrain grew steeper, the road rougher, with loose stones and deep ruts that made every foot of progress menended. But the Moravian breed proved equal to the challenge. They leaned into their harnesses with grim determination, their powerful legs finding purchase where lesser animals would have struggled. their coordinated effort keeping the heavy wagon moving steadily upward. Margaret called rest stops every hour, allowing the pigs to drink from streams and catch their breath. Lydia documented their condition carefully, noting that while they were clearly working hard, they showed none of the distress or exhaustion that would have crippled ordinary swine at this distance. By late afternoon, they crested the final hill and saw Pineville spread out in the valley below. The pigs had pulled the loaded wagon 18 miles in less than 9 hours, including rest stops and Henry's interference. It was a remarkable achievement by any measure. Robert Mills stared at the town ahead, then back at the pigs, shaking his head with obvious amazement. "Miss Thorne, I've been farming all my life, and I've never seen anything like this. You were right. Your uncle was right. These animals are extraordinary." They rolled into Pineville just as the setting sun painted the sky orange and gold. Word of their journey had somehow preceded them, and a small crowd gathered at the general store to see the famous pigs that had supposedly pulled a commercial load across 18 miles of hill country in a single day. The store owner, a weathered man named Callahan, examined the goods in Robert's wagon and found everything arrived intact and properly secured. He looked at the pigs with undisguised respect. "Miss Thorne," he said slowly, "I've been in commerce for 30 years, and I've seen every kind of hauling animal there is. If what Mr. Mills tells me is true, if these pigs really pulled this load all the way from Harlan County, then you're sitting on something valuable. Real valuable. I know 3 freight companies that would pay good money for access to animals with that kind of endurance." Margaret felt hope bloom in her chest, fragile but real. "Would you be willing to put that in writing, Mr. Callahan? A statement of commercial interest that I could show to potential investors or breeding partners?" "I'd be happy to," Callahan replied, "and I'll spread word myself. Kentucky needs working animals that can handle rough terrain, especially with the economy being what it is. Horses are expensive to feed and maintain. Pigs that can work like this, that could change transportation throughout the hill country." They stayed overnight in Pineville, the pigs resting in a borrowed pen where they received the finest feed and care. Margaret could arrange. Lydia wrote detailed notes while Margaret sat with Duke, checking his legs and hooves for injuries, finding him tired but sound. "We did it," Lydia whispered, sitting beside Margaret in the lamplight. "Margaret, you proved everything your uncle believed. These animals are incredible." "We're not done yet," Margaret replied, though she couldn't help smiling. "I still need to get us home safely, and I still need to find the money to pay Henry." But for the first time since inheriting the farm, Margaret felt genuine confidence that solutions were possible. She had proven the pig's worth beyond any reasonable doubt. Now she just needed to find the right people to recognize that value. The return journey to Harlan County took 2 days, moving more slowly to spare the pigs after their exhausting trial. But even the slower pace felt triumphant. Word of the endurance trial had spread through the hill country like wildfire, and at every farm and settlement they passed, people came out to see the remarkable animals that had pulled a commercial load farther and faster than anyone thought possible. Several farmers approached Margaret with cautious questions about breeding rights, asking what it would cost to introduce Moravian bloodlines into their own livestock. Margaret, guided by advice from Lydia and Robert, quoted prices that seemed almost impossibly high to her, but were met with serious consideration rather than rejection. By the time they reached Harlan County, Margaret had secured 3 breeding contracts, totaling $175, payable upon successful delivery of piglets in the spring. It wasn't quite enough to cover Henry's debt immediately, but it was close, and the promise of ongoing income made the future look remarkably different than it had just days earlier. Sheriff Avery met them at the town limits, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes showing approval. "Miss Thorne, you've caused quite a stir. The mayor wants to see you tomorrow, and the town council has called an emergency meeting." Margaret's brief elation faded. "Are they going to try to take the pigs again?" "On the contrary," the sheriff said, and now he allowed himself a small smile. "Henry Calhoun tried to convince them you'd failed some kind of test, but word reached Harlan about your trial before you did. Doc Hanson received telegrams from Pineville merchants confirming the journey's success. The council wants to officially recognize your pigs as valuable agricultural assets and apologize for doubting your competence. Henry must be furious, Robert observed. Henry is desperate, Sheriff Avery corrected. He's been counting on acquiring your land, and now it's slipping through his fingers. Be careful, Miss Thorne. A desperate man can be dangerous. The warning proved prescient. That evening, as Margaret settled the pigs back into their renovated pen, she noticed something wrong immediately. The fence had been tampered with, boards loosened in a way that would have allowed the animals to escape if she hadn't discovered it. Fresh tool marks scarred the wood, and a broken padlock lay in the dirt. Margaret felt cold anger replace her exhaustion. Someone had tried to sabotage her, to create an incident that would justify destroying the pigs, despite everything she had proven, and she had little doubt who that someone was. Sheriff Avery, summoned immediately, examined the damage with grim thoroughness. I can't prove it was Henry without witnesses, but I'll have a deputy watch the farm at night from now on. And Miss Thorne, I think it's time we had a public conversation about your debt situation and Henry's behavior. The next day's town council meeting was nothing like the hostile confrontation Margaret had endured weeks earlier. Mayor Preston, looking distinctly uncomfortable, officially commended Margaret for her successful demonstration of the Moravian breed's capabilities. Several council members who had voted against her previously now offered stilted apologies, but it was when Sheriff Avery stood to speak that the meeting's tone shifted dramatically. Mr. Mayor, council members, I have concerns about Henry Calhoun's conduct regarding the Thorne farm, he began. Mr. Calhoun has twice attempted to spook Miss Thorne's animals during public demonstrations, and I have evidence suggesting he may have tampered with her property in an attempt to create an escape incident. More troubling is the debt he claims Miss Thorne owes. Henry stood abruptly. That debt is legitimate, documented, and due in 6 days. My patience with Silas Thorne's eccentric projects ended when he died. I want my money. Then you'll have it, Margaret said quietly, standing to face him across the room. I have contracts worth $175 that will be honored in the spring. I can pay you $100 now from the proceeds of the endurance trial and the remaining $100 within 4 months with reasonable interest. That's not the agreement, Henry snarled. Full payment in 60 days. That was the term. Terms that were never formalized in writing. Sheriff Avery interjected. I've checked with Mr. Pemberton. Your arrangement with Silas Thorne was a gentleman's agreement based on supplies provided over several years. While the debt is real, the payment timeline was never legally established. Miss Thorne's offer of partial payment now and the remainder within 4 months is more than reasonable. I won't accept it, Henry said flatly. Then perhaps you should explain to this council why you're so determined to force Miss Thorne into foreclosure, Lydia said, standing beside Margaret. Could it be because you want her land for less than market value, because you've spent years trying to acquire the Thorne property and see her inheritance as your final opportunity? Henry's face reddened dangerously. That land is wasted on a woman who doesn't know the first thing about proper farming. Those freakish pigs should have been slaughtered years ago, and everyone here knows it. What we know, Doc Hanson said, rising from his seat, is that Miss Thorne has demonstrated competence, courage, and agricultural knowledge that puts most of this county to shame. Those freakish pigs represent a valuable genetic resource that could benefit every farmer struggling with transportation costs. And your attempts to sabotage her success have been both obvious and disgraceful. The room erupted in murmurs. Several farmers Margaret had spoken with about breeding contracts stood and voiced their support. Even people who had been skeptical weeks earlier now seemed uncomfortable with Henry's aggressive stance. Mayor Preston banged his gavel. Mr. Calhoun, the council finds Miss Thorne's payment proposal reasonable. You'll accept $100 immediately and the remainder within 4 months at 5% interest, or you can take the matter to court and explain to a judge why you rejected such a fair offer. What's your decision? Henry Calhoun looked around the room, seeing the shift in public opinion written clearly on every face. He had overplayed his hand, and everyone knew it. For a long moment, Margaret thought he might explode with rage. Instead, he grabbed his hat and stalked toward the door. I'll take the $100 now, he said coldly, and the rest better be paid on time, Miss Thorne, or I will take you to court. Don't think this circus act you've pulled changes anything fundamental about your situation, but it had changed everything, and they both knew it. After the meeting, Margaret stood outside the church with Lydia, Robert, and Sheriff Avery, feeling something close to victory for the first time since inheriting the farm. "You'll need to be careful over the next few months," the sheriff warned. "Henry Calhoun doesn't forget grudges, and he doesn't lose gracefully. Keep your property secured, keep detailed records of everything, and don't give him any opportunity to claim you've defaulted on your agreement." "I will," Margaret promised. "And Sheriff, thank you for everything. You could have made this much harder for me." "I believe in fairness, Miss Thorne, and in giving people the chance to prove themselves. You've done that and more." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Margaret with her friends. "What now?" Lydia asked. "You've proven the pig's value, secured breeding contracts, and neutralized Henry's immediate threat. What's the next step in building your uncle's legacy?" Margaret looked toward the farm in the distance, where 6 remarkable animals waited in their pen. "Now," she said slowly, "I prove this wasn't just a one-time success. I build a sustainable operation. I document the breeding program properly. I show other farmers how to work with the Moravian breed safely and effectively, and I make sure my uncle's 20 years of work weren't in vain." "That's going to take time, money, and considerable effort," Robert observed. "I know," Margaret replied, "but I have time now, more money coming, and I've learned I'm capable of more than I ever thought possible. My uncle saw potential in me that I didn't see in myself. I'm not going to waste his faith." As they walked back toward the farm together, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling more comfortably on her shoulders. The battle wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more skepticism to overcome, more people like Henry who would resist change and progress. But she had proven she could fight those battles and win. The inheritance she had feared just weeks ago now felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. 6 months later, Margaret stood at the fence of the rebuilt pig pen in the soft light of a spring morning, watching Duke teach his offspring how to respond to whistle commands. The 4 piglets, born to Bessie 8 weeks earlier, tumbled over each other with clumsy enthusiasm, but already Margaret could see flashes of the intelligence that made their father extraordinary. The farm had been transformed in the months since the endurance trial. The barn had a new roof. The farmhouse had been repaired and painted. The fields, still modest, showed green shoots of crops that would provide both income and feed for the growing herd. Margaret had used the breeding contract money wisely, investing in improvements that would make the operation sustainable rather than just surviving. More importantly, the farm had become something of a destination for progressive farmers throughout eastern Kentucky. 3 times a month, Margaret hosted training sessions, teaching people how to work with high-intelligence livestock breeds safely and effectively. She had even begun writing articles for agricultural journals, documenting the Moravian breed's characteristics and capabilities, ensuring the knowledge her uncle had accumulated wouldn't be lost again. Lydia had become a permanent fixture on the farm, moving into the guest room and helping Margaret manage the administrative work that came with breeding contracts, training appointments, and growing recognition in agricultural circles. Their friendship had deepened into something more, a partnership of mutual respect and shared vision that gave Margaret strength on difficult days. Henry Calhoun had been paid in full, his final installment delivered 2 weeks early just to deprive him of any complaint. He had accepted the money with poor grace and had largely avoided Margaret since, his defeat in the matter of the Thorne farm apparently too bitter to acknowledge publicly. Other farmers who had once sided with him now quietly inquired about Margaret's breeding program, though pride kept them from admitting they had been wrong. Sheriff Avery still stopped bi-weekly, checking on security and progress with the protective interest of someone who had bet on an underdog, and watched that bet pay off spectacularly. Doc Hansen visited monthly to monitor the herd's health and add to his growing documentation of the Moravian breed's unique characteristics, but it was the quiet moments like this, standing alone with the pigs in the early morning, that Margaret treasured most. Duke approached the fence as he always did, pressing his massive head against her hand in greeting, and Margaret scratched behind his ears the way she had learned he preferred. "You saved me. You know, she told him softly. You and the others. I came here expecting to fail, expecting to lose everything Uncle Silas left me. Instead, you showed me what I was capable of. Showed this whole stubborn county what's possible when you look past fear and superstition to see what's really there. Duke grunted contentedly, then returned to his piglets, continuing the patient teaching that would help them grow into the remarkable animals their bloodline promised. Margaret thought about her uncle often, imagining him watching from whatever place the dead occupy, seeing his life's work finally receiving the recognition and protection it deserved. She had found his final journal entry last month, tucked into a book of agricultural techniques, written the day before his fatal heart attack. 20 years I have protected this bloodline, believing someday someone would understand their value. I am tired now, and I fear my time is ending, but I have hope. Margaret has her mother's compassionate heart, but my stubborn spirit. If anyone can see past the fear to the truth beneath, it is her. The pigs will know. They always know who can be trusted. I leave them in her hands and pray I have not placed too great a burden on her young shoulders. You didn't, Margaret whispered to his memory. You gave me exactly what I needed, even if I didn't know it at the time. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and Margaret heard Lydia calling from the farmhouse that breakfast was ready. She gave Duke one final pat, then headed toward the house, her steps confident on land that was truly hers now, earned through courage and perseverance rather than simply inherited. The curse on the pig pen had never been a curse at all, she reflected. It had been a test, a challenge to see who would be brave enough to look beyond appearances, to trust intelligence and observation over gossip and fear. Her uncle had spent 20 years trying to prove that truth. Margaret had done it in 6 weeks, not because she was special or gifted, but because desperation had forced her to see clearly what others refused to acknowledge. The pigs weren't cursed. The fear was the curse, and Margaret Thorne, unlikely heir to a failing farm and a legacy of misunderstood animals, had broken that curse simply by refusing to believe it. As she reached the farmhouse, Margaret turned back for one final look at the pen. The pigs had settled in the sunshine, peaceful and content, no longer hidden in shadows or shrouded in superstition. They were simply extraordinary animals being allowed to be exactly what they had always been. And that, Margaret thought with quiet satisfaction, was exactly what her uncle had dreamed of all along. The keeper's pen was no longer a place of darkness and fear. It was a place of possibility, of careful breeding and scientific observation, of intelligence honored rather than feared. It was a legacy worth fighting for. And Margaret would protect it for as long as she had strength to stand at the fence and watch over the remarkable creatures her uncle had saved from extinction. The story of the cursed pig pen had ended. The story of the Moravian endurance breed was just beginning. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.